Hi, everybody. Leah Klett here with the Christian Post, and I'm so honored today to be joined by former Vice President Mike Pence. His brand new book, written with his daughter Charlotte, is called Go Home for Dinner. Go Home for Dinner really emphasizes prioritizing your family, right? Regardless of how busy you are, you know a thing or two about busyness. So share why you wrote this book.
Well, a couple of years ago, it made it into the news that I was writing an autobiography, which was published last fall. It's entitled "So Help Me God," and we're grateful for the response that it got around the country. But when I met a friend on a trip with the Heritage Foundation, I recount this in the opening pages of the book, and he said, I heard you were doing an autobiography, and I'm very interested in reading that. I'm a Christian conservative myself and interested in politics and government. But then he said to me, the book I really want to read is how you have the kind of family that you have living the life that you've lived in politics. And I told him, well, first, God gets the glory. I was humbled by what he said. But that was where Go Home for Dinner was born, in the encouragement to really take some time and to put pencil to paper and really try and capture some advice for people, whether they're involved in public service or whether they're just involved in the private sector or in almost any walk of life. All of us with families are always trying to balance that. And I think by God's grace and by putting some in some cases biblical principles, in some cases just good wise practices into effect, that our families not only been able to survive over the last 38 years of our marriage, but really to thrive. And the ability to write this book, to tell that story, and how for me it all begins when you go home for dinner. It was a real privilege. The other part of this, Leah, that was a joy was being able to write this book with my daughter, Charlotte. She's an accomplished best-selling author in her own right, a working journalist, but she's also a new mom. She's got a baby about 9 months old, and the chance to really write this book with a member of my family who lived a lot of it as a child and as a young adult, it was a great joy for me. So that was the genesis of the book, and I've been very encouraged since word of the book came out and since its release at the response that we're getting around the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you were really stressing the importance of family dinners, being around the table together. How did this tradition really shape your approach to both family life and your decision-making process during your political career?
Well, early in my years in Congress, when I started to show up a little bit more on cable news shows and um, started to be talked about for a leadership role in the Congress that I would eventually hold, people would ask me something of a flattering question, Leah, that goes something like, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" That's a way in Washington that people try and compliment you in more of a backhanded way. And I'd always answer the question the very same way. When people would say, "Where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years?" I'd say, "Home for dinner," because the truth is, I never need to be motivated to work hard. I actually like working hard. I've had a calling for public service since my youth, and so the opportunity to have an impact on issues affecting the nation, the opportunity to serve the people of my state and nation, is something I never have to be motivated to do. But to make the decision to shut down at the end of the day, or to make decisions in our life to make it possible for me to be able to go home for dinner on a regular basis, that I had to be intentional about. And I think for many busy men and women, it's very easy to just keep going in the course of the day and catch a meal on the fly late in the day. But for me, growing up, it was that dinner table that not every day, but most days provided a continuity, a place where me and my brothers and sisters could see my parents' marriage in action, could kind of listen in on what was happening, and as we grew older, to participate in the life of our family. And Karen and I, we made decisions along the way, moving our young children to Washington, D.C. when I was elected to the Congress. They lived with me in suburban Washington, D.C. during the school year, and went home here to Indiana often and spent the summers in Indiana. But having them there, spending time with our kids, our daughter moving home when I ran for governor of Indiana, uh, uh, and uh, and ultimately when we were vice president, just taking steps to make sure that we stayed close to our adult children is it, I honestly believe that Ronald Reagan said all great change in America begins at the dinner table. And when I think about the challenges that we're facing in America today, at home and abroad, when I think about the the concern that tens of millions of Americans have for the future of this country, I can't help but think that just encouraging people to focus on your own, to make your family a priority again. To as I said in the title of the book, I hold the view that faith makes a family, and family makes a life. And in these busy days, I hope to go home for dinner, and the encouragement and the stories in that book hopefully make people smile, but also maybe make them think about their own corner of the world, and being there for their spouse and for their children in new and in renewed ways. That's how we'll strengthen America, is by strengthening families and faith.
And we do live in a culture where busyness is really celebrated, right? It's kind of countercultural to spend time with your family. What practical advice do you have for people who work long hours to carve out time for their family when it's not something that's necessarily encouraged by mainstream culture?
Well, I think you're exactly right. Is first, I think you just have to decide that you're going to put your family first. And as we wrote in the book, if God didn't exist, it would never make sense to put your family ahead of your career, because there would be a cost to that. The truth is, our culture likes to tell young people that you can have it all, you can have everything, and you actually can't. But I have come to believe that since I put my faith in Jesus Christ as a young man, and have been working ever since that spring day in 1978 to make that walk with the Lord real in my life. I do believe that when we make God's priorities our priorities, that He blesses us, and I don't mean in material ways. I mean in deeper and more meaningful ways, in terms of richness in relationships and satisfaction in life. There's that Bible verse that we have in the book that He prospers His beloved even while he sleeps. And so in my lifetime, I have found that the time where I've hit the keyboard and shut off the computer and gone and sat down with those three little kids when they were your kids' age, and as they got into middle school and into high school, and while I had 1,000 other things on my mind, I made a point to focus in on them, focus in on my wife, as she did the same with our kids and with me. So many times over, I found the more I made my marriage and my family a priority, the more unexpected opportunities came our way. And in fact, it is in chapter 3 of the book, I talk about having heard a sermon in 1997 that really focused me on my core mission in life, which is not to be a public servant, not to make a difference in the world. My core mission in life, if you look at Genesis chapter 18, God, speaking of Abraham, was see to the members of your own households they would do what is right and just. And the balance of that verse says, so that the Lord will fulfill his purpose for him. And it was 30 years ago that I heard a sermon on that Bible verse at Community Church of Greenwood with Dr. Charles Lake. And it was a time in my life when I was struggling with my purpose, with my calling. I had tried politics and failed a few years earlier. But it was in that moment, hearing that sermon and focusing on Genesis 18:19, I had a renewed sense of my real purpose, and my real focus in life has to be Karen, Michael, Charlotte, Audrey, and now their wonderful spouses, and now my 3 beautiful granddaughters. And the more I focus there, the better equipped I am to meet unexpected opportunities that come to us in my professional life.
Absolutely. Now, in your book, you discuss the challenges that you and Karen faced, from infertility to professional setbacks. How did these experiences, these challenges, really strengthen your commitment to your family and to your faith?
Well, all of us experience disappointment. I have a little bit of familiarity with that in the last month, as we felt called to run for president of the United States this year. I think the country's in a lot of trouble, and I felt we couldn't walk by on the other side of the road with a lifetime of experience in the Congress, in the White House, and as a governor. But ultimately, while we worked hard on the campaign, as I announced a few weeks back, we concluded this is not my time. And while we feel disappointment about that, people that have asked me about it since, Leah, they've said, how are you doing? And I said, well, everything in my life that matters is great. I mean, my wife loves me. My kids are healthy. I stopped counting after that. And I think when we really focus on really making God's priorities our priorities in our life, that then disappointments that come in our careers are put in their proper perspective. I'm not saying it's any easier to come up short in a campaign, and I've lost a few, but in comparison to the rich relationships in our families. But then beyond that too, we've also lost loved ones. I wrote candidly about the sudden death of my father when I was a young man in my late 20s, and in this book and in my previous book, I talked about how I really struggled with that in my faith. But again, in the chapter of Go Home for Dinner, entitled "Children Heal Your Heart," I spoke about the fact that when our son came along after years of infertility and frustration, just 3 years after my father passed away, I felt like that was when I really began to heal. And so, there are disappointments in our professional life. There is heartbreak in our personal life. But in so many ways, I really think the Bible again and again focuses us back on the family and back on those relationships that not only sustain us and give us meaning, but also bring real renewal in times of hardship and loss.
Mm. So now that your kids are older and out of the house, how often do you get to visit with them?
Well, I would tell you that the former Second Lady of the United States is the consummate scheduler. And over the last 3 years, we've done a lot of traveling around the country with speaking for on college campuses and in political settings and in business settings. And Mrs. Pence almost invariably finds a way to divert to spend time with our kids that are in California, Arizona, and Florida as we speak. And I have a sense, Leah, that that's accelerated a little bit since our granddaughters were born over the last 3 years. But the great part about the modern era is while we write in Go Home for Dinner, we write very candidly about the need to create space around social media. That adage of in the early days of having a BlackBerry back when they had them, which were the early versions of what the iPhone now fills. We had a rule at our house that when I came in and I came home for dinner, I would put the phone in the dish. and turn off the notifications so that it would not be a distraction. Because social media in so many ways can pull us away from the people that we're actually with, distract us from investing quality and quantity time with people that are most important. But the good part now with our kids all across the country is that whether it's texting or a phone call or a little bit of FaceTime, we stay in regular touch with our kids and get out to see them every chance we can.
As the holidays approach, what advice do you have for families to avoid a heated political debate when we gather around the table?
Well, I think first and foremost is, the when you go home for dinner, I really do believe that it is a place where we learn um, how to disagree without being disagreeable. And we've lost some of that in America today. I mean, there's been a coarsening of the political debate in our nation today. And there's a part of me that thinks that some of that comes from the fact that people are spending less time with their own families. And so I would never advise families about how to avoid conflict around the dinner table. I come from a big, diverse family on both sides, and but I do think that when you sit down and you break bread with people that are part of your family, I think it brings with it a reminder of the history that you have with people, and whether you may agree or disagree on a particular issue, that there's so much more that connects you to people than could ever separate you. And I think for our country too, Leah, that was what I found. You asked about what I learned when I was vice president. I honestly believe most Americans that what unites us in this country is will always be much greater than whatever divides us. I mean, most Americans, cherish our freedoms. Most Americans cherish faith, love their families, want what's best for their kids and their grandkids and their future. It's that we get into the details of policy where we have differences of opinion, differences in some values, but I really do believe it's around that dinner table that you're reminded that you have with a family member across the table, that you've got history, you've got common experiences, and that creates the conditions where you can have dialogue. And I do believe that as our families grow stronger, as if we were to return. I mean, today we have, by most accounts, almost an epidemic of loneliness in the country. About 1/3 of all households in the country only have one occupant in America. That was 1 out of 10 not too long ago. And statistics that we recite and Go Home for Dinner prove that people are spending less and less time with their families. People are putting off being married. We all know the tragedy of the divorce rate in this country. But I really do think that as you see some of the divisions in the public square in this country, I think they're related to people spending more time out there than around that dinner table and with their families. And so